Hi, my name is James Snell. I am a journalism student at the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. This video is for my final project in online journalism, so thank you for watching. In 1981, my father, who was a geologist, went to Africa and discovered one of the richest gold mines in history in Mali. I guess it would be about 35 years later, that gold discovery actually resulted in his suicide, which created a terrible situation for my family. So the story I want to tell you is about how I recovered in part from my father's suicide. After the event, my mother Madeline went to live with a retired psychologist in the Slocan Valley in the Kootenay area of British Columbia. So mom was pretty devastated. She was living with, like I said, with this PhD psychologist, a woman named Dr. Fern Cooper, and she met a man at Fern Cooper's Bible study. The man had a long beard, he had big woolly hair, and he could play the piano, and he could sing. Turns out the man's name is Ken Scott. Now, Ken Scott is an interesting fellow. It turns out he was and is one of the most sought-after yogis on earth. He invented something called acro yoga, or contact yoga, yoga for relationships. And so anyway, my mom fell in love with Ken. They became good friends, and my mom moved in to Ken's cabin right next to Enterprise Creek, which is between Slocan City and Silverton, BC. It was and is a remote mountain property that had a lot of cedar trees and a lot of bush and bears and little trout in the creek. So my mom came to live with Ken Scott. Ken Scott's yoga name is Nateshvar, which means King of Dancers. His name was shortened to Tesh by Woody Harrelson's limo driver, as Tesh and Woody are good friends. So anyway, my mom was living with Ken, and I was well traumatized from my dad's suicide and just wondering what was going to become of my life. I really didn't know. And honestly, I didn't have much hope either. So I ended up selling or dumping most of my possessions, and I headed west to the Kootenays to join my mom, not knowing what I was in for and not knowing what would happen. Really, I was on the verge of becoming a street person, really, just all broken up inside. I remember the day I arrived at Ken and my mom's cabin on Enterprise Creek. The driveway was very, very steep and precarious, and too steep for most vehicles. And what I remember, the wind in the cedar trees. I remember looking up the mountains, and I remember the rushing sound of Enterprise Creek. And I got there, and it was a tiny, tiny little shack with 2 or 3 rooms, and I met Ken, and I saw the way my mom and Ken were living, which was without electricity, without running water, and without real adequate heat either. So my mom was wearing Demi Moore's housecoat. It turned out my friend Ken and our friend Ken was involved with Demi Moore on a movie set, a situation that landed him on the cover of a tabloid magazine as Demi Moore's yoga hunk. So I kind of knew right away that this little cabin with Ken and my mom was going to be my home as well. And so I settled in, and I remember the first night there, I slept on the floor next to Ken's bed, and it was so cold, and I went, and I think it was about 3 in the morning, I got up, and I remember the moonlight shining through the trees and into the cabin, and I went and got a piece of firewood and put it on the fire, and it became pretty apparent that the firewood was wet, or damp at least, so the fire wasn't very hot and the fire wasn't really, doing very well. And so I ended up going back to bed, and I fell asleep. And I woke up the next morning to Ken and my mom singing in the living area where my mom was sleeping. And they were cooking up pancakes, and I think there was a joint being passed around, and they were drinking coffee and just having a wonderful morning. And that situation really set the scene for what would be the next 6 months or so of my life. It turned out that Ken was a real wonderful guy, and I think it's pretty incredible to reflect on his accomplishments. He was, Hillary Clinton's private yoga instructor. I believe he was in the White House and was later disavowed. He spent time with Peter Gabriel and Peter Gabriel's father in Great Britain, which was a significant benefit to Peter and his father. And that trip to England resulted in a song written for Ken called Father and Son. In the past, Ken had done a lot of contact yoga with Robin Williams, Deepak Chopra, Tony Robbins, and just a whole suite of the rich and famous were seeking Ken out for yoga practice. And so that's who my mom and I lived with. And we got to work within days. We borrowed a chainsaw, we cut a bunch of firewood, and we started clearing the forest of brush, and we got involved in planting like a garden, and it was just like a lot of physical work of just moving things around and just really having a wonderful time. Nobody had a lot of money either. I don't think Ken had much money. My mom had no money, and I arrived in the Kootenays with very, very little money. And I remember like not having a lot of food. Like we just didn't have a lot to eat. But it was still really wonderful, and we just got real creative with what we were making. And a few months after arriving at Ken's place, I started a painting business, and I called it Gentle Jim's Precision Painting. And it was reasonably successful, and I made enough money to keep us all in food and gas for our vehicle. And that was pretty good, and I was fully supported by Ken and my mom. And eventually our friend Ken left for Toronto, and my mom and I moved in to an abandoned cabin next to Fern Cooper's place on Slocan Lake, and it was just an interesting time. We're actually in a position of squatting because we'd never met the owners, and the cabin was abandoned, so we had no running water, no electricity. But again, we just had my mom and I had just this wonderful time of just living and eating and drinking a little bit of wine when we could afford it, and trying to stay warm. And it was a pretty hard time, but it was also a wonderful time.